Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well this Friday. It's Friday, yay! 2 days off um, that are coming up. And are there any questions before I start the lecture? All right, then let's dive right in. So quiz 8 is due today. If you haven't taken it yet, please take it before 11:59 p.m. Quiz 9 opens tomorrow, and it's going to be due not on Friday next week, but on Wednesday. So you'll have a bit less time to complete it. Please submit it on Wednesday before 11:59 p.m. And quiz 10 will open shortly after. So quiz 10 will open on midnight on Thursday. And we have a short participation assignment due today. There is only 2 questions. So after lecture, make sure you go on web courses and complete these 2 questions for the contained in the participation assignment. So the lecture today is going to kind of wrap up the evolution with speciation and extinction. The evolution portion of our course will end today. And on Monday, I will start with, according to schedule, on Monday, we're supposed to review the evolution, but I thought about it, and it seemed to me that it would make sense to do that before the exam. So you'll have a short revision of the whole evolution and the whole ecology section of the course on the same day or 2 separate days. Because if I push the lecture for review of evolution to before the exam, then on Monday it's going to be the whole week dedicated to review. So Monday we'll review the evolution, Wednesday we'll review the ecology, and on Friday you will have the exam. So you'll have to spend less time on exam prep. Okay. So species, any questions about that? Okay, let me open the chat box. Okay, Lauren says that's great. Great, great, great. Okay, so let's dive right into the speciation and extinction. So Earth is pretty old. It's about 4.5 billion years old, as I mentioned a couple of lectures ago. So many species of life appeared about 3.6 or 3.5 billion of years ago. It's a big span that I noted there, but yeah, I cannot remember precisely. So many species have appeared on Earth, but they did not suddenly pop into existence as they are now. So many years ago, like 3.5 billions of years ago, Earth, the life on Earth was not as diverse as it is now. The species kind of evolved into the diversity we have right now. So instead, but the population slowly became the populations of the same species, let's say, they slowly became isolated into subgroups, the subpopulations that could not interbreed. And because these subpopulations could not interbreed for a long time, for thousands of years, they eventually evolved into different species. So the speciation and extinction lecture will be dedicated to the mechanisms that promote speciation, that are responsible for the speciation, as well as some definition of the species, as well as some extinction events and what caused them. So first, it would make sense to define a species. Like what exactly is a species? Let me move some videos out of my view here. So species are distinct groups of organisms, but the definition of species has changed over time. So species is defined as a distinct group of organism that interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So this is the most common definition of a species. It is a distinct group of organisms that interbreed, that mate with each other, okay, and are able to produce fertile offspring. All of these words are important. All of these elements are important to understand. Okay, if a group of organisms are not interbreeding, they're not the same species. If the group of organisms are interbreeding but are not producing offspring, they are not the same species. If a group of organisms are interbreeding and produce offspring, but the offspring is infertile, they are not the same species. Okay, so all of the elements of that definition are important to capture once you're defining it, when you're defining a species. There are millions of species on Earth, which evolved over billions of years, and this picture kind of gives a snapshot of diversity of the species. So in here we see some species of bacteria, a species of a tree, a species of a bird. So the current diversity, currently the species are very diverse. The organisms vary wildly in their shapes and forms and how they function, but all of them basically emerged, have had at some point had common ancestor. So all of them evolved from basically the same proto-species. And the way we kind of know that is through DNA. I kind of touched on it in the lectures before this one, but remember that when we look at the DNA, the sequence of the nucleotides, when we have two DNA samples from two different organisms, if we have a lot of nucleotide sequences in common, it likely points at a common ancestor, because it's highly unlikely, it's like astronomically unlikely that the sequences of nucleotides kind of mutated in the same way between the two organisms. There have been many efforts to somehow organize species, but the most prominent effort was conducted by Carl Linnaeus in 1700s. So Linnaeus classified species based on their appearance. Earth species name combines the broader classification genus with the term species. And I'd like to think back to the very, very early lectures in the course when we looked at the organization of life and how we classify different life. So the broadest classification would be, does anybody remember like the highest level of the hierarchy of the organisms, like what comes first? And I'm talking about things like kingdom, family, domain. Farouk, excellent. So the highest level of classification of life is the domain. After domain comes kingdom. After kingdom comes phylum. After phylum comes class. After class comes order. After order comes family, and after family comes genus, and finally the lowest level of organization of organisms is species. So Linnaeus is the dude who kind of built that classification, and it's impressively accurate. Although he classified species based on their appearance, the classification that he basically conducted, the classification that he developed, was impressively accurate, given that he did not use molecular techniques at all. But since the classification by Linnaeus, there have been some reclassifications, but proportionally, there have not been a lot of species who have been reclassified, like placed in a different phylum or placed in a different genus. And the reclassification has been happening because of the development of the molecular techniques and basically evaluating how accurate the original classification of species is based on the molecular evidence, based on the building the phylogenetic trees and exploring what kind of common ancestors the species have. So the kind of fun fact about Carol Linnaeus, or his way of classifying species, his belief was that species didn't basically, whatever he observed at a particular time in terms of species diversity, that has existed from the very beginning. That has existed from the very beginning of life on Earth. So he did not, well, that was before the idea of evolution or natural selection. And he just assumed whatever he's describing at this point in time, this is how it's always been, and this is how it always will be. And now we know that's not true. We know that there's natural selection going on, as first proposed by two dudes, the Darwin and Wallace, Charles Darwin and I think Alfred Wallace. And we know the molecular techniques allow us to take a deeper dive into like how species diverge from each other and what kind of common ancestors they had before. Okay, so there are several approaches to defining species. There are three kind of aspects of defining species. Well, are there three? No, there are two. So Carol Linnaeus kind of proposed the very first one. He basically said species that organisms that look alike belong to the same species. But with the development of the field of biology, a new um, a new definition of species has arisen. So modern biologists use biological species concept to define species based on their ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So again, species are a group of organisms that interbreed and produce an offspring that can produce some more offspring. So new species form when some individuals can no longer interbreed with the rest of the group. So there can arise various impediments to groups of organisms to interbreed. And if these barriers exist for thousands of years, the group of organisms become sufficiently different on the molecular level that they cannot produce offspring or cannot produce fertile offspring. Thus, they're diverging into different species. However, some species cannot be defined by reproduction. Uh, and does anybody have an idea what kind of organisms, what kind of organisms would not fall under this definition of the species as group of organisms that interbreed and produce fertile offspring? It's Friday, but I know you're not dead in there. I know some of you are paying attention. So William says bacteria, very nice. Nicholas Arter says prokaryotes. That's exactly right. So species that do not reproduce sexually, they do not fall under this definition of species. So how the heck are we classifying those? How do we know those are one species of organisms? How do we know like bacteria of species E. coli, Escherichia coli, is different from some other bacteria species? So if we're not classifying, if we're not sticking to Linnaean definition of species, which was species is a group of organisms that look alike, how would we classify like bacterial species more accurately, more precisely? And the answer to that comes from the molecular biology. So the molecular definition of the species is the group of organisms whose DNA is similar by 97%, is 97% identical or more. So if the DNA of a group of organisms, if the DNA of individuals is like 97% identical or higher, they are considered the same species. So to explore the species of the organisms that do not reproduce sexually, and to refine the definition of species or check whether organisms are the same species in organisms that do reproduce sexually but look very similar, and there's no time to observe whether they mate and produce the fertile offspring. Researchers go to molecular techniques and they compare the nucleotide sequences of gene that organisms have in common. Right. So does it make sense? Those are kind of three definitions of species. The old one proposed by Carolus Linnaeus, which was species is a group of organisms that look alike. The newer one, the modern one, the modern definition of species is that it's the group of organisms that interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And the third definition of species, which is a molecular biology definition, species are a group of organisms whose DNA is 97% or more identical. Any questions about that so far? Makes sense. Yay. Yeah, that's going to be all of the material from now on is going to be easier and relaxed, and I planned it that way so that because we don't have a spring break, I know everybody's tired and everybody's kind of at the end of their ropes, so hang in there. It's going to be easy material. Just keep on, okay? Okay. So how does a new species form? As I mentioned before, there may arise some reproductive barriers can arise within a population that causes basically for one population to become first two populations and then two species altogether over thousands of years. So technically, a new species forms when a subgroup in a population can no longer breed and produce fertile offspring with the rest. So as subgroups or subpopulations gene pool shifts and it begins to follow like its own independent evolutionary path. And does anybody have a guess how would like how would a gene pool in a population shift? How would it be possible for the species to become so genetically different that they will not have 97% of their DNA nucleotide sequences in common? We've covered this. Christine, good guess. Extinction is good guess, but I'm asking about the gene pool. Like, how is it possible that in the formerly same species, which have been separated by some barrier, how is it possible that the gene pool in one species will become very different from a gene pool in another formerly the same species? Natural selection, uh, yes, very nice. So natural selection, but what? Uh, yes, the short answer is yes. But what would cause the original? Yeah, okay, we'll stick with natural selection, and I'll just give you the answer. Mutations. Remember the DNA mutates, and it's particularly notorious for mutations during the errors. There are lots of errors produced during DNA replication. So there are some mechanisms that kind of prevent the errors from happening, but once in a while, these mechanisms are faulty, and the DNA that is replicated basically is not the same as the DNA that was provided that was used to copy the new strand that was used to produce the new strand of DNA. Um, so lots of mutations are happening during DNA replication, and if these mutations kind of are isolated in a different population subgroup, eventually lots of the mutations may stay within the populations, within a new population, and this population can become genetically different from another population that was, formerly the same species. Okay, this was kind of garbled, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So these things that prevent interbreeding, these conditions that prevent interbreeding, are called reproductive barriers. And the reproductive barriers can occur either before or after formation of a zygote. And again, and the zygote is a fertilized egg. The zygote is what forms once male and female gametes meet each other. Or in other words, there are pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic reproductive barriers. The pre-zygotic reproductive barriers are the barriers that basically prevent the zygote from formating, and post-zygotic reproductive barriers are barriers that happen like after the zygote has formed. And I'm gonna go into more detail about what kind of barriers are there, classifying them as pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. So first, I'm going to go through some pre-zygotic reproductive barriers that basically prevent fertilization. So the most common one, or the most kind of the first one that may jump into mind is habitat isolation. And the example that is given here has to do with ladybugs that may prefer different habitats. So if one group of ladybugs that formerly belonged to the same species started to prefer different plants to eat and to breed on, then eventually these two populations of the ladybug, one that prefers this plant, another group of population that prefers this plant, over lots of generations, they may become sufficiently genetically different to be classified as two different species, because they will not interbreed, and they will not produce fertile offspring due to sufficient like differences in their genetic makeup. So the second type of isolation is temporal isolation. The subpopulations may change their behavior based on the like food availability, maybe. But basically, the example that is given here is field crickets that mature at different rates. So, and as a result, they're active or fertile at different times. So, because this group of crickets matures in maybe early summer, and this type of crickets matures in late summer, they cannot physically meet and interbreed. So the barriers that are basically introduced by time of maturation, they're called temporal isolation barrier. Now, the third type of isolation, reproductive isolation, is behavioral isolation. The example that is given here, it deals with toads or frogs, sorry. Uh, let's say over time, two subpopulations may produce different mating calls, and females are attracted to different kind of songs that two subpopulations of frogs produce. And eventually, over time, this can cause the divergence in species. Now, the fourth type of reproductive isolation is mechanical isolation. And it's like the example that is given here is the basically two different sage species, and mating organs or pollinators are incompatible for the two sage species, and that causes further divergence of the species from the formerly the same ones. And finally, the final type of reproductive isolation is gametic isolation. So the example that is given here is the sea urchin, two species of sea urchins that release their gametes into the water. Okay, so the sea urchins release sperm and eggs into the water, and these sperm and eggs just float around. And the reason why the sperm and eggs from different species cannot form a zygote is because the gametes have unique surface molecules that make an egg recognize sperm of the same species. And if the sperm is not of the same species, the egg just is not going to recognize it, and it's not going to form, the gamete is not going to form. So fertilization is not going to occur. So this is the gametic isolation. Now, post-zygotic reproductive barriers, there are basically three post-zygotic reproductive barriers. The first one is hybrid inviability. So basically, it's when hybrid offspring fail to reach maturity. The example that is given here is that of eucalyptus. So hybrid eucalyptus seeds and seedlings are not viable. So just to clarify, post-zygotic means that the two individuals from different species did mate, but but something happens with their offspring that prevents their viability or fertility or survival of their offspring. Okay, so let's say two different species of eucalyptus did mate, uh, and there was a hybrid produced, meaning a hybrid of like individual that was produced by fertilization of sperm of one species by an egg of another species. But the hybrid eucalyptus seeds and seedlings are not viable. So seeds never grow into a full mature eucalyptus tree that could then reproduce. So, and when that happens, it's considered a post-zygotic reproductive barrier that is called hybrid inviability. Now, the second post-zygotic reproductive barrier is hybrid sterility. And the like kind of bright example of that, very prominent, there are two very prominent examples of that. One example is when lions are crossed with tigers and they produce a hybrid liger. So lions and tigers are two different species, but they can interbreed and produce an offspring. But this offspring that is called liger, they cannot produce an offspring themselves. So because of that, the lion and tiger are considered two different species, because according to biological definition of a species, the species is a group of organisms that interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So these guys can interbreed and produce an offspring, but this offspring is not going to be fertile. Okay, and this kind of reproductive barrier is classified as post-zygotic, because this technically the zygote has formed, but the hybrid is sterile. So another prominent example of this kind of situation is when donkeys are interbred with horses, they produce mules, and the mules are infertile, they're sterile. Like if two mules, like they cannot, meiosis is not happening in mules, like meiosis breaks down and they cannot produce gametes. And that is why they're sterile. So to get another mule, you'll have to interbreed horse and a donkey again. You cannot like mate. The mules cannot really produce an offspring. And the third type of post-zygotic barrier is hybrid breakdown. So let's say we have two different species of mosquitoes, and individuals of these species are able to produce an offspring. And this offspring, technically, it's not infertile, because the offspring can produce the mates, but the second generation offspring produced by the hybrid species of mosquitoes, it cannot produce offspring anymore. So it's called second generation breakdown of the hybrid. And it's basically these, in this particular example, the second generation mosquitoes have misshapen genitalia, so they cannot reproduce. And technically, this is not, because of this, as this happens, the original two species of mosquitoes that produce the first generation hybrid are considered the two separate species. Okay, that was kind of a lot. So are there any questions about pre-zygotic barriers, post-zygotic barriers, and what kind of, maybe some clarifying questions, maybe you didn't understand something? Now is the time to ask. Christine understand it, which is great. What about everybody else? Habitat isolation. Yes. So habitat isolation is a pre-zygotic reproductive barrier, meaning it's kind of a reproductive barrier that will not result in a formation of a zygote. So the individuals that belong to different species, they will not, they maybe could produce a zygote, but they won't because they live in different places. Okay, so this is habitat isolation. It's when individuals of different species, maybe they, if they met in a in one habitat, on like if these two these two ladybugs met on the same leaf on the same plant, maybe they could produce some offspring that would be considered fertile, but they won't because they just prefer different plants and they will not meet, and that will cause further differences, further divergences in their genomes. Okay, so Sokyun, was that clear enough? Habitat isolation? Yes. Okay. Now, Lauren asks, can you go back to behavioral isolation too, please? So, behavioral isolation is when individuals of different species, maybe they could produce a fertile offspring, but they basically are not attracted to the individuals of the opposite sex because of behavioral issues. Maybe in the case of frogs, the females are not going to be attracted to a song of a frog of different species. They're only going to be attracted to the song of individuals of the same species. But if they were attracted by some chance to a song of different species, maybe they could produce fertile offspring, but they just won't because they're, I don't know, it's not their jam. They're just not gonna get attracted. And this is considered a pre-zygotic barrier again. Lauren, I hope that clarified it. Okay, and Alice comments, this is interesting. Yes, this is fascinating, and this is one of the reasons I love biology. There's lots of fascinating stuff going on. And these are kind of, maybe you can tell, but these are kind of my favorite topics. These topics and the ones that we're going to cover further, dealing with ecology. Okay. Any other questions? Post-zygotic barriers, pre-zygotic barriers. Okay. So, reproductive barriers keep related species apart, but how do these barriers arise in the first place? How can two populations of the same species evolve along different pathways, eventually yielding two different species? And so the most obvious way is to physically separate the populations so they do not exchange genes. Eventually, genetic differences will give rise to one or more reproductive barriers. So formation of species as a result of physical separation of individuals within populations is called allopatric speciation. So if the individuals, if the, okay, let me slow it down. So in this picture, basically the barrier, the physical barrier that has arisen in a landscape is the mountains. Let's say two continents collided, and as a result, the mountains form. By the way, this is how mountains form: is when two tectonic plates, they move together, and basically one tectonic plate pushes against the other tectonic plate and causes basically um, um, this friction and tension, and as a result, the mountains form. So the mountains formed, and they separated the two populations of the flowers. And over time, these populations genetically diverged. Like one population started producing purple flowers, and another population started producing yellow flowers. And if Carl Linnaeus would walk in and describe these two species, he would classify these two organisms. He would classify it as two different species because they do not look alike. Okay, so this kind of situation where there is a physical barrier, and where when two populations are separated by a physical barrier and they become genetically different over time, is called allopatric speciation. Okay, so allopatric speciation is formation of species as a result of physical separation of individuals within population. Now, in contrast, sympatric speciation is formation of species as a result of something else. Basically, species grow, populations remain in the same physical place, spot, but they still diverge. There's still some divergence in their genetic makeup due to maybe some other reasons. So there's still continuous contact between the populations, but for some reason there's no gene transfer among them anymore. And I will go into further reasons for this sympatric speciation, further causes, potential causes in speciation within the same location. Because it might not be as intuitive to understand why the heck would species diverge uh, if they live in the same thing. What prevents them from continuing to interbreed and produce fertile offspring and for their gene makeup remaining the same? Whereas to me personally, allopatric speciation, like it immediately makes sense. Of course, if species are separated for long enough, they're not gonna be able, like over thousands of years, they can become sufficiently genetically different that they will not be able to interbreed anymore. So first, I'm gonna touch a bit more on the allopatric speciation. The prominent example for allopatric speciation is the speciation that is going on in, like on the islands, and particularly on the Galapagos Islands. So different islands have different food availability. So like some islands in the Galapagos region, they are drier and do not have like vegetation that is near the ground. And some islands are wetter and they have various kinds of vegetation, including availability of vegetation closer to the ground. And in these islands, some islands that have like tortoises that look like this, and some islands that have tortoises like this. And can anybody kind of look at the picture and guess, like, would this tortoise live on the island that has vegetate on the drier islands or on the wetter islands? So again, on drier islands, the vegetation is not available near the ground, and on wetter islands, it is available near the ground. So drier, very nice. Yeah, so you can see this kind of subtle looking situation over here, and this kind of shape of the shell, it's very convenient for the turtle to raise the neck higher. Not turtle. I gotta slap myself for that. Tortoise. Um, so this kind of situation with the shell is convenient for the tortoise to raise the neck up higher and reach the vegetation that is higher up. And again, it's although that you may be tempted to interpret this as like kind of design kind of situation, but it's not. It's just only individuals that had this particular mutation is in the DNA that caused the deformation of the shell. Only those individuals survived and were able to pass the genes to the further generations. All right. When we look at the sympatric, an example of sympatric speciation is basically formation of microenvironments within the same habitat. So an example that is given here deals with a lake and different species of fish. So this deep lake has distinct ecological zones. The larger fish feed near the shore, while the smaller fish feed in the deeper water. And because of these differences in the food preferences, or basically the feeding grounds, and fish basically they breed where they feed. They will release their eggs and sperm wherever there's food available. And if one population of fish prefers to feed near the shore, and another population of fish prefers to feed near the water, eventually, over many generations, these two populations will diverge into different species because they will not, release their eggs and sperm in the same place. And over time, the genetic makeup will become sufficiently different for them to be considered different species. Does Did that make sense, guys? Sympatric speciation. Did that example make sense for you? So technically, both species of fish live in the same lake, but because of their different preferences um, in feeding areas, what was formerly one population of fish eventually diverged into two different species. Okay, so determining the type of speciation may be difficult. So nature is usually a continuum from complete reproductive isolation to continuous intermingling. So, and we may not be able to detect these barriers. And we may not be able to detect these barriers because it's not necessarily the same for each species. And it's also a matter of perspective. For instance, consider a forest stand, consider like a bunch of, a big forest, okay? And forest stand may look small to us, to be considered like just one habitat, but not to insects that live in soil. uh, Imagine like when you were smaller, how big did everything seem? Like maybe you grew up in a house that seemed huge, and then you moved out, spent like some time away doing your own thing, and came back to visit your parents, and suddenly your house doesn't look that big anymore. Suddenly it looks much smaller. So this is what I mean by a matter of perspective. So as a forest stand may look small to us because of our size, but to insects who are much smaller than us, forest stand may be like may be considered like different parts of forest stand may be considered different habitats that may lead to allopatric speciation. And for insects, like if insects evolve in the same forest stand, it may not be considered as sympatric speciation. It may be considered to allopatric speciation because of the barriers that maybe are not visible to us, but make a big difference for insects. So speciation can also occur after mass extinction, because basically if there is mass extinction going on, then the competition is removed. Maybe one species were suppressed by another species, and after the dominant species is removed, that the suppressed species feels more comfortable, expands in the habitat, and because of the expansion in the habitat and more widespread of the formerly suppressed species, they have more, the new formerly suppressed species has more opportunities to diversify. So major environmental changes can kill off many species at once. For instance, if you consider this graph here, it shows the speciation of mammals after the mass extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. So non-avian dinosaurs, there was mass extinction about 65 millions of years ago. And but the yeah, sorry, I got distracted a bit. So the mass extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs occurred about 65 million years ago. And the most kind of accepted theory why that happened is so-called impact theory. So impact theory suggests that meteorites or comets caused dinosaurs to become extinct. And the evidence for this theory is presented by the iridium layers in the rock. So iridium is the kind of metal that does not occur on Earth. So the source of the metal can only be from from the meteorites or comets, like something that was introduced to Earth. Sometimes, so to finish up this example, the mammals were not very prevalent. The dinosaurs kind of dominated the Earth, but after they became extinct, mammals occupied more habitats, and eventually the allopatric speciation occurred, and sometimes sympatric speciation. But mostly because mammals occupied more diverse habitats. They diverged genetically because the individuals within formerly the same population could not meet and interbreed. So other reasons for mass extinctions are basically plate tectonics, and I kind of touched on this before. Plate tectonics. Remember, many years ago, we did not have continents like we have now. We had one solid piece of land called Pangaea, but and if, over time, the plate tectonics, or the movement of the plates that underlie the continents, it caused the continents to kind of move apart and drift, and some continents, they kind of smushed together, forming mountains, and some continents drifted further apart. So if one population of species formerly lived on one continent, but that continent can drift into a separate climate zone, that species may just die out because the new climate is not as friendly as the former climate. Also, if the mountains formed and the species suddenly had less access to food, that could cause like mass extinction because of the lack of food source. So these slow movements of plate tectonics, they can cause and have caused in the past the mass extinctions because of the reasons I mentioned about before. And so previously we had five events, five mass extinctions. And currently we're considered to be in the sixth mass extinction. And basically mass extinction is defined by the rate of species loss. So there's some background rate of species loss, which is very slow. But currently we are in a massive rate of species loss, and basically it's due to us. It's not caused by plate tectonics, it's caused by human activity. And we we profoundly change the environment by causing habitat loss and fragmentation. So lots of a prominent example of that, I guess, would be agriculture. We need food to survive, and since there are more than 7 billion of us already, we need more and more food to support ourselves. And although there are some technologies, particularly like technologies that deal with genetic modifications of crops to increase their yield, it's still not enough to sustain us. So we convert more and more land for agricultural use, and this causes we often convert forests into agricultural land, and that causes habitat loss and maybe habitat breakage. Like the habitat is not as continuous as it was before. It causes species to lose their food source and maybe even become extinct. We create lots of pollution because we need things made out of plastic, we need things made out of cotton. So like the clothes we wear, which is becoming more and more synthetic, it causes more and more oil usage, and oil processing is responsible for a lot of pollution. Also like textile industry. Well, I just mentioned textile industry. What else? Like manufacturing metals creates lots and lots of pollution, and so on. So basically, our needs, because we need lots of things that are not natural occurring, we create lots of pollution as a result. We introduce non-native species, zebra mussels, if you've heard of that issue, introduction of zebra mussels in the lakes in the north, in the Great Lakes. It basically creates pressure for the native species, and it causes extinctions because zebra mussels are hungry little bastards, and they compete very efficiently with the native species for food. And we have over harvesting. We over harvest, let's say, forests, and basically that leads to habitat loss. Uh, So, and that is all I have for today. I just looked at the chat. And are there any questions regarding this? This is the last slide I have for today. Christine asks, I just realized there are only 35 people in class, and don't we have over 300 in this class? We have 387 people in this class. And Christine, I've taught the class before, and it doesn't matter if it's online or face to face. Like 50 people on average will show up to class. And it doesn't matter if it's face to face or online. So, questions? All right. I'm gonna stop sharing, Min. And so what I have some other questions, like Alexander asked, are they having a hard time with their grades? Some of them do, some of them don't. A lot of people do not attend because it's old news to them. There's nothing new. Like in some schools, all of the stuff that I talk about is already covered. So they already know the stuff and they just need the credit, I guess, and they don't need to attend. Some of them have work and they watch videos after the lecture is done. But yeah, I mean, people have different lives, and not everybody lives on the same schedule. Everybody is in their different situations. So Sukyun, in behavioral isolation, you said some species are not attracted by opposite sex, correct? Yes. So like, remember that sexual selection is going on in most species that reproduce sexually. And basically, if one trait becomes more attractive than the other traits to females, eventually that, like the frogs is a good example, really. Like the frogs sing, different species of male frogs sing to attract mates, and different species of frogs have different songs. So um, the female of one species of frog will only be attracted to the a particular kind of song that male of the same species sings, and that's what keeping what keeps the reproductive barrier in place. All right, guys, it's 10:22, so have a good weekend. See you on Monday.